Yo, my name is Chris Lehman, and welcome to the first video in this tutorial series here on my channel. We are going to be looking at a few different tracks from my recent EP, Feelin Young, looking at different parts of those tracks, breaking it down, and working on our mixing skills here. This tutorial series is definitely geared more towards beginner producers. I'm going to try and explain everything as I go, take it as slowly as I can. So if you're a more intermediate or advanced producer, apologies if things are a little bit slow, but I still think that there might be a lot to learn for you too. I'm 24 now. I've been producing since I was roughly 14 years old. Been doing it for 10 years. I think I've learned quite a few things over the years, and I think I have a lot to offer, even for those who've been doing this perhaps for even 5 or so years themselves. But anyways, if you're a beginner producer, definitely stick around. There's a lot to learn, and I'm going to try and focus more on things that I don't commonly see in tutorials all over YouTube, so that this doesn't get too repetitive itself. As you'll notice, a big theme of this video and others is going to be on repetitivity. Not sure if that's a proper word, but repetitiveness, overdoing things, is a big problem I see, and I think that a lot of producers run into, and that I certainly ran into and still struggle with, is keeping things from getting too repetitive. But without getting too far ahead of myself there, this video is going to be focusing on my track Lost in Adventure, which is the third on the EP. It's a melodic house track at the BPM of 125. It's got a 4 on the floor kick pattern, standard Avicii style melodic house song. It is in the key of E flat major, and that's going to be an important thing to know for a few different reasons. And this video is going to focus on just the first 16 bars, the intro, and we're going to go over how to make our intros in melodic house sound more full, more ambient, more dreamy, but still leave a lot on the high end and the low end to introduce over the first verse, the pre-chorus, and the drop or the chorus, so that things still sound epic in the drop, but don't sound boring in the intro. And that's what we're going to be going for today. So let's hop on over to the project and take a look. So as you can see, I work in Ableton Live, and I'm going to try and do my best to make sure that nothing I talk about in these tutorials is Ableton specific. So if you are an FL user or Logic or any other DAW, stick around. There's still a lot to learn. I'm going to try and speak in universal language. So first things first, let me play you the introduction for those who may not have heard the track. Here's what it sounds like. So in order to try and keep this sounding as much like it would in the beginning of the production process, I've turned my mastering off, which in this case is really just Ozone 9. So yeah, the master's off. Still, that being said, it's important to remember with this tutorial and any other tutorial going over a finished product that it is in fact finished for a reason. Much time has been spent with the mix, and don't expect your sounds to sound like this right off the bat, right out of the box. Take some time to mix. As you all know, that's not new information, but it's easy to get down when your mix doesn't sound as clean or as loud or as good in general as when you watch in a tutorial. But just always remember this, that likely that product has been worked on for a while before being put up on YouTube, because everyone wants to put their best content out for the public. So just a short little thing to remember there. That being said, let's hop right into the tips. So the first thing is I'm going to mute everything except for the pad and the ARP, or the main ARP, because I think that that's pretty much where most people start with this type of music in particular, starting with a chord progression, maybe an ARP, and then getting into a melody, some piano, and a drop is how these tutorials tend to go. And I want to focus on some things that aren't as commonly talked about. So you'll notice with just the pad and the ARP, they're playing essentially all of the melodic aspects of the intro here, yet it still sounds not nearly as full as we would like that intro to sound, not nearly as spacious or reverby or delay-y as we would like. And so we're going to work on how to fix that. But anyways, let's just play a portion here with just the pad and the main ARP. So great. That's an awesome place to start. A good go-to chord progression is this one. It's really overused, particularly in this genre. But hey, chord progressions are always overused. If you've ever seen the Axis of Awesome 4-chord song video or any other out there like it, there are chord progressions which are overused. Don't be ashamed if you use a chord progression which is overused. There's a reason it's overused. It's because it sounds good. And there are so many other aspects to production which you can take advantage of to make your song unique that at least starting with an overused chord progression is never a bad thing. So anyways, we're going to play the pad just on its own. We're going to go over a few tricks here, turn these effects off, and we get this sound. Awesome sound. Remember that sound selection matters. If you're not into sound design, your preset choice matters. You can tweak it a little bit, but make sure that the sound isn't just okay, doesn't just work, but that it sounds good on its own. And so then the effects you add to it make it sound great instead of just good. And that's something I certainly overlook a lot. I want to hurry to get to that epic finished product. So I throw together a bunch of presets that just work, but aren't great. And if you take the time to watch some other YouTube videos and learn some presets from them, or to just mess around with a bunch of presets yourself, whatever plugin you're using, whether it be Nexus, Silent, Serum, any other, take the time and you'll see a lot of the presets I learned. For those who are much more involved in the melodic house community, you'll know that a ton of people use them and that they're sometimes overused, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, I don't think. It's because we've found some sounds that work. So this pad here, used by more than just me. But yeah, it's this pad. Yeah. The delay, I've got a fair amount of delay. It's on ping pong. It's pretty decent low cut to make sure it's not interfering with the lows. High cut, make sure it's not interfering with too much of the highs. And then a lot of reverb right here. And we've got a low cut and a high cut again. And then the master filter, low pass. And we've got it cut off quite a bit so that we've really just got the lows there playing. And then with our EQ filter, we're cutting out the lows that we don't want, and even a little bit more of the highs to make sure we're getting that exact frequency register that we want, which for an intro, generally speaking, you really want just mids, particularly in this genre. So let's listen to what that sounds like with the EQ. You'll notice particularly the EQ removes the lows that we don't want. Next thing is OTT. Again, used by everyone a ton, partly because it's free, partly because it sounds great. No shame in using it. So we got a little bit of OTT for some sizzle, and then this other free plugin called Wider from Polyverse set at 74% to give it some stereo width. And stereo width is something that beginner producers, I think, should focus on more. I don't think it's talked about as much in entry-level tutorials, and that's because it's a little hard to understand, particularly for beginners or particularly for people producing without using higher quality headphones or good studio monitors. Feeling the difference in stereo width can be a little difficult and take some ear training over time to learn really what it means. But let's play this sound without this on. And we're going to turn it on right now. If you've got some good headphones or monitors, you'll be able to hear that. If you're playing this just out of a computer speaker or definitely out of a phone speaker, you won't. But it's spreading things to the left and right. And that's what we want for a lot of our sounds. A lot more than we want to be just in the center. But that's the default, is right in the center. So leaving everything in the center isn't going to work. So finding that balance takes some skill, takes some practice, but you'll learn over time. And using a combination of stereo widening plugins, such as this plugin called Wider, or any other number, is a good way to get that sound quickly. Another way is through direct panning. You can see I've panned this ever so slightly to the left, along with our main ARP, panned ever so slightly to the left. We've got another ARP, which I'm going to get into in a minute here, panned to the right, and some vocal chops, also panned just one to the right. And those, you can't, it's not obvious necessarily when I play the sound for you. For instance, when I play this, if you hadn't known, or if you hadn't looked right away, you might not know that that's panned. But small adjustments like that in the context of the mix make a big difference. Very general rule here, certainly doesn't apply to everything, but a rule I like to follow is that small, subtle differences add up to a much greater, better sounding mix than going for just a few large adjustments. And it stinks because we all want to get there fast, but it's important to remember that a lot of the time, big changes, such as maybe a huge EQ boost to your leads or throwing on a ton of OTT, may sound great on an individual track or even a group of tracks, but in the context of the mix is usually going to lead to muddiness and clutter that we do not want. So anyways, there's our pad.
Oh, bro. Yeah, what's up?
Apologies there. Had someone walk into my room. I'll cut that out, but yeah, there'll be a little bit of a pause there in the video. Can't remember exactly where I was in my thought, but anyways, panning, it's important to do, and it's something that adds a lot to your mix. So anyways, there's our pad. That's a place where a lot of people know to start with a chord progression with a pad or a piano. Then we take the chords, which is really what these are, broken up into 16th notes with slight variations staying in the key that we're working in. We find a sort of ARP sound that we like, a common one in this genre. Again, it's going to Nexus, the guitar's expansion pack, going to one of these nylon guitars, and we're going to be working with a lot of reverb, but I'm not using any of the delay. So that on its own is going to sound like this. Cool sound. But again, there's too much high end, definitely too much low end going on, such that as an intro, working with the pad, it's too much for what I want in the beginning. And we want to leave some of that stereo field to be introduced later on in the mix. So we're going to work with a filter. We're going to turn that on, and you'll see what this sounds like compared to this. Much more dramatic, emotional. And then we're just going to let more of the highs filter in over the course of the verse. That's a tip that almost everyone knows about at this point, so not as if that's new information, but just that's what's going on there. So yeah, we've got then Pancake, which I also believe is free, but I'm slightly less sure. I can't quite remember. It's just set on the default left to right. The mix is at 55%, and it's going to add some auto panning. So it's going to pan for me without having to automate it in from left to right. And again, you're going to need headphones or monitors. I'll stop saying that now. Just assume that to hear the difference with a lot of the plugins and effects I'm talking about, you're going to need headphones or monitors. So this is going to send the audio from the left back to the right and back and forth consistently throughout the entire track, which is going to add stereo width and going to add a feeling of bounce to our ARP. And then again, some wider. And then the finished product here is going to sound like this. So yeah, it sounds great. And with our pad, we've got a great bass for our track, and we've got a great bass for our verse. We can automate in the ARP, add a few percussion elements, maybe even introduce a melody, and we've got an intro verse. And most people know how to do this at this point. The question is, how do we make it feel more full without adding too much, say, bass or lead or too many pads to the point where it feels so full that when the pre-chorus and the chorus come, they don't feel like they're adding a whole nother level of energy to the track, which is what you want them to add. So what I am going to do here is move on to a second ARP, which, since we are working in E flat major, is going to be playing the root note, the perfect fifth, and the root note an octave up, with a few other notes which are in the key of E flat, working with the chords, but not entirely following the chords to build some happy tension to not oppose, but work with our chords to add a layer of, like I said, tension to the mix, to keep things from getting too boring, too repetitive. So this ARP is not arpeggiated by me like the guitar was, where I drew in all the 16th notes. This is going to be sustained, and we're just going to use the arpeggiator in Nexus to get that arpeggiated sound with some delay, some reverb coming from Nexus. Again, focus on your low cuts and your high cuts of your reverbs and your delays, whether you're using them from the plugin or you're using a reverb or delay from your DAW or a third-party plugin. Always focus on EQing the reverbs themselves to make sure that the mix isn't getting muddy by adding too much high end or too much low end to the reverb. So if that doesn't make sense, we're cutting off the high or the low of the reverb, but not of the actual sound itself, so that the top end of your sound is just the original unprocessed sound, and then it's the middle that's getting the real reverb effect on it. And in that way, it keeps your mix from getting too muddy. The high end, the low end, you'll notice over time, are the ones that are most prone, most apt, generally speaking, to getting muddy fast. And so we want to prevent that from happening. So we've got a cutoff here again to give it that intro feeling that we want. We're using an EQ to make sure it's exactly what we want. And this sound, again, with some wider, panned ever so slightly to the right, another commonly used in the melodic house production community sound from Nexus that I'm not going to try and pronounce, but it sounds like this. And then we're going to add the pad and the ARP. Okay, we're getting somewhere. It adds a lot, but yeah, as you can see with our EQ, it's not adding a lot in the way of low end or high end, but it's still, because of our panning, because of our wider, because of our reverbs and our delays, which are EQ'd accordingly, it's not muddying the mix, it's adding more just to that center that we want. So next we're going to move on to something to make it unique. Pad, ARP, are used all the time. It sounds great, but I wanted to add something a little different that you may not see as commonly. And since I'm not a fantastic singer, I'm working on it. I don't have a fantastic microphone either. I didn't feel like producing professional quality vocals was something I could do, and I didn't want to make this a remix. Um, so instead, what I went for in the way of vocals was just some vocal chops, which were meant to be used as an ambient sound rather than a melodic lead vocal sound. So I used Arcade, which is a plugin which you can pay for on Splice. Costs $5 or $10 a month. Can't quite remember, but still, it's not a ton if you can afford it. Um, there's a ton of people in the producer community, obviously, who can't really afford anything. And so I'll try and always share free plugins if I can. But there are ones where, if you are fortunate enough to be able to afford them, are going to be worth your money in the long run. And I think Arcade is definitely one of them. It's a great, quick way to get awesome sounds. And there's so many different banks that cover so many different tools and uses that I just totally think it's worth the money. But when it comes to vocal chops, I think Arcade beats anything that I've seen or used before. So Distant Voices is a bank which is great for ambient vocal chops. And then I went for this specific, I don't know if it's a bank within a bank, whatever it is, this specific bank in Distant Voices called Zenith or Zenith Falls. And then if you haven't used Arcade before, the way it works is you just select your key right here, like I did, E flat major, and then all the white keys here, rather than say playing a C, they play a vocal chop or a sound which has been assigned to that white key, all in the key that you have selected up top. So it's a great way. You can just play the white keys on your MIDI keyboard on an actual keyboard, or you can draw them in, and you're always going to get sounds which are in key. And then it's a matter of choosing which ones you like, when you like them, and they sound really great with minimal processing. So this is panned one to the right. I've got some wider on it, EQ, cutting out the lows and the highs, and even some of the mids there. You'll notice that this is at negative 1.6 to not let things get muddy, make this feel super wide and ambient. And these vocal chops are going to sound like this. So yeah, it's a really cool sound. You'll notice I choose a few different sounds throughout the verses here, and these again are being used as sort of an ambience to give it that more dramatic feel that we're looking for in our intro. The only automation that I've got going on is just a little bit of volumation here when it transitions from the verse to the pre-chorus. So yeah, now we've got all the melodic aspects, well, most of the melodic aspects of our intro here, and together they're going to sound like this. So great. The next thing I add here, which maybe I'll go over in a later video, is just a snap, and again, for some progression. But that's another thing that I think most people might know, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. Now we're going to get into the ambiences. And, well, first, let me, before I do those, quickly just talk about what I'm doing with my effects here. I've got two different impacts. And to keep that intro feeling, I'm cutting off the highs here, adding a little bit of reverb. In this case, I'm using Valhalla Shimmer, and they sound like this. So, yeah, um, just sort of standard thing, but rather than just throwing them on there, focus on your EQ. Um, make sure that if you're going for this filtered type of intro, that your impacts aren't getting in the way of that by having too much high end coming out of them. Focus on finding ways to add reverb that don't muddy your mix. In this case, I used shimmer and turned the mix down a little bit, kept the reverb mode in mono because I wanted these to not be too wide. I wanted my instruments to be covering the stereo field and not my impact. So those together with the instruments are going to give it that more beginning feeling without feeling like it's coming out of nowhere. And spend some time finding some good banks of samples with impacts, downlifters, etc. It's worth your time to find ones that pretty much sound good on their own so that you don't have to make them yourself, or every time you go to start a track, you have to spend some time looking for new samples. Just get a couple different banks that work really well. One of my go-tos for any house production is this ultrasonic progressive house essentials, which I purchased maybe a year or so ago, and I use it all the time. It's got lots of great effects in it, and would highly recommend. Also has great kicks, snares, claps, etc. for any style of house music. So now that our impacts are done, we're going to turn off our instruments and focus just on our atmospheres. I'm going to turn off the effects, add those in last. And we're going to start with an ambience, which is just some nature sounds. A lot of people use this, and they're going to sound like this. Pretty cool sound there. Sounds like it was recorded in a wide open space, which of course, since they're nature sounds, in theory, they should have been. So it sounds like there's some nice reverb there on its own. And we're not going to have to add a ton to get that really atmospheric sound, which we're looking for, which is pretty cool. So the next thing I've got is these evolving violins, and they are in the key of C, as you can see. So we had to transpose them up 3 semitones. If you use Ableton and turn on your warp, turn it to complex so that when you transpose it, it doesn't change the timing of the sample, which is not what you want. It'll throw everything off, even though it's in key. You want to keep it, or you want to make it in the right key, but still keep it with the right timing. So this is panned a little bit to the right with no effects on it, and it's a violin that's going to sound like this. And together with the nature sounds. So those are pretty cool on their own. But I wanted to add a few more things to really make this feel super full. And that is this New Beginnings evolution, also in C. So again, transposed. And it's going to sound like this. It's like a string section with a little bit more aggression, and meant to be used as a little bit more of a transition. As you can see, looking at the audio here, it builds and falls right in this crucial transition place after the first 8 bars. So it's going to sound like this. I'm going to turn the percussion back off. So that, with the strings and the nature sounds, let me just show you the other 2 elements, and then we'll play it all together. The next thing we've got here is a choir with an EQ cutting out the lows, cutting out some of the mids. It was a little too much in the mids for me, as is. And what I did here was I added kickstart, but it's only hitting on the first bar of each beat, which gives it some rhythmic effect rather than using it as traditional side chain in a drop that would be used to dip out the volume when the kick plays. This is just allowing the instruments to be the attack on the first bar of each beat so that the ambience isn't getting in the way, but I can still have it pretty loud, enough so that it can be heard. So that was just something that I added there. You can try adding that on different ambiences. Sounds pretty cool. So this choir is going to sound like this. And again, it's just playing the root note, the fifth, and the root note. And pan to the left to offset the panned right strings. And then finally, another arcade sound, just some ambience from this True Splendor from Aura in arcade. Set our key, set our filters and our effects where we wanted them to be, added some wider, added some EQ to make sure that it's just the mids again. And this is the pattern that I drew in. Keep forgetting to turn these on. You get the idea there. Yeah, so I thought that was a cool ambient noise. You'll notice when the rest of the verse is playing into the build, I literally just left this one note, and that's because as more instruments are introduced, I didn't need these extra melodic elements in the ambience. It just was causing muddiness. So in the parts where the fewest instruments are playing, I've got the most going on with the ambience. And generally speaking, that's a rule I try to follow. So just something to think about with your production. So there is the arcade, the choir, the evolving strings, the evolving violins, the nature sounds, and that's going to make up all of our atmospheres. The next thing we're going to add is some ping pong delay to them, some Valhalla shimmer again. Make sure I'm in stereo here. We don't want our atmospheres in the center of the mix in mono. Our EQ is going to look like this, following pretty much everything else we've been working with, but allowing a little bit more highs, certainly no lows. Cutting the mids ever so slightly adds to the feeling that the atmospheres are super wide. So then we're going to add a lot of wider, make it super wide, and then kickstart is being turned on just for the drop because I leave the atmospheres playing in the drop to help make the drop feel super full. But but obviously I don't want any of my sounds getting in the way of the kick, so it is sidechained to the kick. But for the purpose of the intro, this kickstart does not matter. So our atmospheres on their own are going to sound like this. Cool sound. So then there's one last thing I wanted, and that was a small amount of vinyl crackle just to fill it up a little bit more. So I duplicated just a random track. It doesn't need to be an extra track. It could just be an audio track or anything. You'll notice that this MIDI track has nothing playing. There's nothing here. The only purpose of this track for me is that I like the vinyl sound from RC20 Retro Color. So this effect, whether you've got any MIDI being played, will, if you turn up the vinyl enough or the distortion enough, as I did here with this cassette first generation preset, I might have tweaked a few things, might have not, I don't remember, but this is what this looks like. On its own, even with no MIDI being played, you'll notice still makes some vinyl crackle. Which is a really cool sound, and that's going on throughout the entire track. It's pretty quiet here at minus 12.9 dB, and again, it's just the vinyl from the RC20. There's no There's no guitar being played. None of that. It's just the vinyl. So that's what that sounds like. And that, together with our instruments, our impacts, and our atmospheres, is going to be how we're going to get that epic, reverby, delay-y, dramatic, emotional sounding intro that is full of just mids, so that when we introduce our bass and our melody, they feel like truly new elements to our mix. So let's play. I'm going to leave the percussion off. Let's just play our first 16 bars. We'll put a pause there and come back to focus on the rest of the verse and the pre-chorus in next week's video.